Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing the power of paradox with best-selling author and professor of management at the University of Delaware, Wendy Smith. Learn how great leaders tackle the complex challenges of interpersonal dynamics, team performance, institutional change, and perpetual innovation in order to transform their organizations. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Professor Wendy Smith. She understands the skill set required to be a great leader and what it takes to run a high-functioning organization. Francis Scott Fitzgerald once said, "The test of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." I could not agree more. This interview really resonated with me as we live in a complex, fast-paced, and ever-changing world. The demands on our attention, our time, and all of our resources seem to grow in number and intensity over time continuously. As a result, it seems that we are faced with new, increasingly difficult choices every single day. For example, do we invest in the digital transformation or in developing our people? Should we focus on getting repeat business from existing clients or winning new clients in new markets? Do we pursue radical innovation and disrupt ourselves, or do we focus on continually and incrementally improving what we are already doing? Online networking or real life? So what's the best choice? We are hardwired to crave certainty and clarity. Do we pick A or do we pick B? But it really is a matter of choosing one or the other. Why not both? Listen up as we discuss the power of paradox. Check it out. Hey, Wendy, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the podcast today to talk about a very interesting way of leadership and decision-making, the power of paradox. And we're going to talk about your best-selling book, Both and Thinking, Embracing Creating Tension to Solve Your Toughest Problems. Very interesting topic. I think it's applicable to so many of us and look forward to hearing your thoughts on it.
Well, thanks. I'm excited to talk about it.
Let's start with a very simple question, and that is, what is the definition of a paradox? People may use the word, but they may not understand what the definition is.
We define paradox as persistent, interdependent contradictions. So here's what we mean by that. And I want to just contextualize this word. We, in the research that we do, and when I say we, it's myself and my colleague and longtime collaborator, Marianne Lewis, have noted, or if you look back, this idea is about 25,000 years old. We're drawing on insights of indigenous wisdom, Eastern, Western philosophy from like 500 BC. And we are arguing that the idea of paradox and living into paradox, that we in the leadership world, we in the organizational world, we in the human psychology world are late to the paradox party, because this is an idea that has infused research on physics and quantum physics and how we think about the material world. It's an idea that has infused psychoanalysis and how we think about the individual and a collection of interdependent opposites. But we haven't really embraced it effectively in leadership in the organizational world and how we make our own decisions. And we're arguing that this idea and the approach of both anding our decisions is really the next leadership capability after emotional intelligence. So 20 years ago, everybody needed to know about emotional intelligence. We're arguing that now everybody needs to know about how to both and hold paradox, navigate paradox.
Now, clearly, we know your impetus to write this book was because you felt that there was a vacuum. People didn't quite understand it. And I'll be the first to say I knew nothing about this until I was doing my research for this podcast. Give us some background. How are we traditionally programmed to make decisions as human beings? And just give us some examples.
Yeah, and it might help to sort of situate this. I started studying this idea of paradox because I was a doctoral student. I was doing a PhD in organizational behavior, and I was studying how large companies like IBM were trying to make strategic decisions when they were trying to both be operationally successful in today and innovate for tomorrow. So this massive question about innovation and change And how do you do that while also simultaneously ensuring stability and clarity and operational performance? And then I started studying this and around the concept or the idea of social responsibility or sustainability or social enterprises or whatever we want to talk about, of organizations that have a financial bottom line and business purpose and have to bring in the revenues and have to make profit or have to cover their costs, but at the same time have a broader social and environmental mission. And I've done, and to, to speak to your audience, I've done a bunch of work with medical professionals who are grappling as either a for-profit or a nonprofit with what does it mean as an organization to navigate the ongoing tensions between cost and care, and how do we think about that? And so these kinds of tensions come up all the time, certainly in our leadership, but definitely in our own individual lives. The tension between cost and care, or social and financial, or global and local, or focusing on the self or the other, or in our careers, work and the rest of our lives, or, now a huge question, how do we manage the be in person, be, virtual? How do we deal with all of those kinds of tensions? And the dominant way that we as humans are programmed, I want to say this empathetically, we are programmed to see these things that are in conflict with one another, to pull them apart, and to figure out which one we're going to choose, and then to be consistent once we've made that choice. We don't like inconsistency. And we do that in part because the openness of the question makes us feel uncomfortable. There's a lot of uncertainty. We want a clear decision. And what we argue is that's an either or approach. Pull it apart, make a choice, stay consistent. That kind of approach is limited at best and detrimental at worst. It's really minimizing the way that we can move forward in our own private lives and in our organizations.
So just to summarize, because it's important for our listeners to really take it in before we move into paradoxical thinking, but traditional thinking, either or, A or B, it is what we're programmed to do, but it is limiting, it's constrained, and paradoxical thinking can be very disruptive because it's not what we're used to. And I just want to make sure that that's what we're summarizing going into the next part of our discussion.
Absolutely. And I would offer a challenge to your listeners. One of the things that I hope people take away is, in the next day or so, to notice how often decisions that come to us, our immediate reaction is to ask it or to frame it as an either or. The more that we can be aware of that, then we have opportunity and then we've got to talk about why it's problematic, but then we have opportunity to change the way we think about it.
So, moving into incorporating paradoxical thinking into our everyday decision making, explain how it increases creativity and success.
Yeah, and maybe just to lay this out, like, why is it a problem to either or? You got to make a decision. I mean, most people would push back. You're like, let's just make a decision. And in fact, so much of the way that we business school professors, academics have trained leaders and individuals is make a clear decision. And I want to just sort of lay out it's problematic for what we call three vicious cycles, or three big reasons why it's a problem. It's a problem, first of all, because oftentimes what we'll do is make a decision, reinforce that decision, kind of get ourselves around people who agree with that decision, reinforce, sort of create all the context, the expertise and the knowledge and the systems to reinforce that decision. And then it's like going down a rabbit hole. We get stuck and we get too narrow. So we intensify around it. And this becomes a problem because when things change around us, or when there's possibility to take in broader information, we're stuck. So we call that getting stuck down the rabbit hole. What then happens is that you make a decision between opposing ideas, and things change and you're like, oh my God, I can't just, and you switch all the way to the other side. We call it overcorrecting, and we use the metaphor of a wrecking ball, because at that point you just completely shift and switch. And so, one of the things that we see in organizations, for example, is, oh, we've got to reinforce, everybody's got to be creative and innovative and running around and doing new things. Oh my God, this creativity is killing us, or this innovation, and it's too much investment. We've got to hunker down and just make sure that we're super successful. And so we make these huge swings where we say we throw out the baby with the bathwater. And then I want to just name this for this audience, because the worst is that when it comes to the different, this kind of tension, opposing ideas, what tends to happen is we pick a side, and then we reinforce that side and we defend it and we assume that there's a right, and if there's a right, the other side has to be wrong. And so if we're right, they're wrong, and we get into this kind of polarizing conflict. And we see that in organizations between, I don't know if in the medical organizations, between the doctors and the administrators, and that ongoing just headbutting. We see that in our politics right now, that polarization. And we call that trench warfare because the image is that what we do is we sort of dig a trench surrounding ourselves with the other people that support us. And we just immediately shoot out at the other side without really understanding their point of view and really engaging and respecting and valuing what they say. We sort of dehumanize the them because they're not the us. And all of those limit us in the possibilities that we have to build a more creative solution together.
I mean, I couldn't really summarize it better. I mean, you said it best. It's that we're moving towards this polarization in everything. Politics obviously being the most obvious. And I think that, like you said, the more polarized you are, the less successful you're going to be. And so, yeah, I agree. And let's get into some examples so people know that, some of the world's greatest geniuses ever in history have been these types of paradoxical thinkers. And you mentioned examples: Einstein, Picasso, Mozart. Kind of explain how these geniuses accomplished what they did in large part due to their paradoxical thinking.
There was a great professor of psychoanalysis, Albert Rothenberg, and he wrote this great book. And he was from Harvard. And he wrote this great book, The Emerging Genius, and sorry, The Emerging Goddess. And he was looking at, and his question was, how do geniuses come up with great ideas? And people like the names you mentioned, Picasso, Einstein, Virginia Woolf, the author. And what he did is he went back through their correspondences and went back through their letters and their diaries to say, how are they thinking about ideas in order to come up with their big, the theory of relativity or Virginia Woolf's great novels. And what he found was what he calls Janusian thinking from the Roman god Janus. And the Roman god Janus is the two-faced god that's looking forward and backwards at the same time. And the idea was that they were all drawing on noticing these opposing pressures. So for Einstein, it was, how can an object both be in motion, moving, and at rest at the same time? That was the question that was posed to him, or that he posed to himself in thinking about the theory of relativity. Or in Virginia Woolf's novels, how do we navigate something that is both valuable, death and rebirth, or death and birth, and bringing those in relationship with one another? Or for Picasso, it's light and darkness. Or for Mozart, it's concordant and discordant notes. And so each of them said, these are really in opposition with one another. How do we bring them together? And their genius work was figuring out how to accommodate both of those at the same time. We talk about that in the book as both anding to find a creative integration, the win-win, the moment, we talk about that, or the metaphor we use for that is a mule, because the mule is the oldest living hybrid that we as humans have, biological hybrid that we as humans still bring together, which is smarter than a donkey, stronger than a horse. You've got a mule. But one of the things what we notice in the book, and one of the things that came out in my very first research project, was that not all both anding can allow for a mule. There's not always this like perfect ideal, everything works simultaneously, beautifully. And this came out when I was studying IBM, and I was expecting in their both anding that they would find these like moments of creative integration, these brilliant moments between their existing world and their innovative world. And they did sometimes, like there were some decisions where it was like, this can accommodate both of these. But what we found in that study, or what I found, and this was my dissertation study, was that more of the time, leaders who are living into the both and do what we call being consistently inconsistent. And what we mean by that is that over time, they're accommodating competing demands, but they're making these shifts or slight tweaks between these opposing ideas. And so we use the metaphor of a tightrope walker, because the idea is that you are moving forward, you are on the tightrope, you are sort of staying balanced, but you're never fully balanced. You're constantly balancing, and you're making these slight tweaks between left and right. So you're making these slight decisions. Sometimes our decision more emphasizes the care that we're offering as doctors and the personal relationship in the hospital. And sometimes they are more emphasizing the cost and making sure that we keep costs down. But you can't overemphasize one side or the other, or else you topple over. Oh no, Rick, I hope we can edit this because I can't hear you.
S- Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No, perfect. I was going to say, you mentioned IBM. I wanted to get, in your opinion, what corporation, what company has done the best job of and or both thinking?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of them, and we can go through a couple of examples. The one that we highlight in our book is, sorry, can you hear that?
Yeah,
Yeah, hold on. So, I was going to kick him out of here, but he was asleep.
that's all good. We can, you
Edit
want to, I'll
that
just,
part out too. Sorry about that.
yeah, we can edit it as long as, is he leaving?
Yeah, he's going to shut up. Uh, there are a number of examples of companies. The one that we highlight in our book that we really love to use it as an example is Unilever, the packaged good company that was run by Paul Pullman from 2008 until 2018-19. He came into a dying company that was overloaded with costs, and their products were like moderately valuable at best. And he walked in and made a strong commitment in 2008 that they were going to commit to what they called the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, a commitment to a very explicit set of goals for social advancement, environmental impact. And they were not going to do this at the expense of costs or the expense of their finances, but they were going to do this to double their bottom line. And one of the things when we interviewed him that he said to us is, number one, in order to do this, we had to have a very clear, overarching mission, goal, purpose, higher purpose that all of these things would bubble up and be part of. So their higher purpose is making everyday living sustainable. And number two, he said to us, look, by doing this, by committing to these three big buckets of goals, this is going to create tensions all the time. So they had questions like, do we create products in smaller packaging that allows us to sell at a higher margin and make more money, or larger packaging because that minimizes the environmental footprint? Like things like that would come up all the time. And his point was, in order for the company to move forward, they had to name, identify, raise, surface those tensions so that they could work through them together and come up with better options, not let them sort of be swept under the rug.
And I think what you're doing is you're highlighting something that you always talk about, which is the world is changing. It's changing rapidly. And in this day and age, the world favors paradoxical thinking, whereas maybe in the past it didn't favor as much. It wasn't as dynamic. Can you explain that concept?
Yeah, and I would tweak that a little bit. I would say the world demands of us paradoxical thinking because it's complex. So, again, we situate this idea 2,500 years ago as a big philosophical idea, and would say that so we would say these tensions exist. You can go out and find them, but that there are conditions under which they bubble up and become more salient to us. And we talk about in our research three conditions: change, plurality, scarcity. There's more change from the past to the present, so therefore the past become the future becomes the present more quickly, and those are in conflict with each other. Plurality, there are more diverse voices that are in conflict with each other. And scarcity, the experience that we have limited resources and therefore have to make more decisions between them. And we are in a world where there is a lot of change, plurality, and scarcity imposed upon us. And so what we're finding is that in order for leaders to effectively lead in this world, they need paradoxical thinking. In the last 20 years, 10 years, what we've seen is consulting companies, um, large organizations come up and say, hey, we need leaders that can live in the and, that can live in paradox, that can navigate paradox. So we have colleagues at Oxford that put out something called the CEO report. They interviewed about 200 global leaders saying, what's the greatest challenge that you're experiencing? And increasingly they just said it's these paradoxes, these competing demands where we can't choose between them. We have to honor them both. Or we do some work with a Danish-based global consulting company called Implement, and they have made as a cornerstone of their work helping leaders live into the power of and. And by the way, this is something that is true on a leadership level. The way we wrote the book and the way that we think about this and the way that we talk about this, it's also true in our personal lives. Like, how do I help my twins live into both and of both of them? Or how do I help them live into they're applying for college right now. How do I help them live into the both and of going out to find the best option for them and living into their passions of what they're really excited about? Like, how do I work with my husband to do a both and of our different approaches sometimes on how we navigate parenting? These kinds of tensions come up all the time.
Now, people would say you've talked about all the positives about paradoxical type
Yeah.
thinking. What are the negatives?
Yeah. People would say, is there ever an either or? When the book was coming out, I live in Philadelphia, and there was a big sign on the highway: text or drive. There is no and, right? So certainly, where does the or come up? I think that one of the questions that comes up is this is kind of complicated, and it's hard. It's emotionally hard to live in the and. Certainly, when you talk to people about politics today, and it feels for some people deeply existential, living in the and is a really hard emotional option. It can get emotional too in companies where you feel like there's an existential threat to your identity and your organization. What does it really mean to live in the and of a large medical system where you really have to take finances into account that might have impacts on your patients? That's hard for some people. So I don't want to paint this as easy. I want to acknowledge that this is not easy. It's important. People will ask, well, does everybody need to live into the and? I think the invitation is to nudge ourselves more and more in that direction so that we can live into a more complex, higher consciousness, deeper experienced world.
Is this type of thinking for everyone, right? Because people may say, okay, is this only for leaders, CEOs, lawyers, doctors, business people, or is this for everyone the way you approach life?
I mean, I think about it for everyone. I don't think everyone needs to use it in the same level or that it's as easy for everyone. For some people, this is something that we think people can learn, can enter into. It's also something that we think different people have different capabilities for. And so, I think about it like the movement toward meditating. Does everybody do it? No. Could it help people? Yeah. Do we all need to be Zen monks? No. Would it help us all to pause and take a breath when we're frustrated and angry, to lower the temperature? And is that sort of one easy step into meditating? Yes. So, in some ways, in that metaphor and that parallel, what we would say is that, at the most basic level, we think that there's value, as I was saying earlier, for people noticing how often they either or, and just pausing and asking the both and question. Okay, and my kids now roll their eyes at me when they're like, well, should we do this or this? Or, it's like, okay, is there an and? What is how can we? And asking that sort of, how can we get to the and question as a possibility? And that to us is the entry level way into, can we complicate our thinking a little more without necessarily overmaxing our cognitive load?
I'm sure your kids have a ball with this. I'm sure kids could take this and, mom, sorry, it's not either or. We're gonna have both. And I'm sure they use that to their advantage as I would
They
as
do.
expected. I'm
with
sure.
with a bunch of eye rolling because I've got but they're great. I actually really I just did a webinar with my kids the other night on this topic, and one of the things that I want to say about that is that they asked me, like early on when we train kids, we think that developmentally kids need black and white choices, and that's been some of the work of Eric Erickson and others. And I remember when my kids were little thinking, gosh, what would it look like to ask them to complicate their thinking even at a young age? And what we're increasingly finding in psychology is that doing that, it's not that we need to wait until they're older for them to move from their black and white thinking, but it's the black and white thinking that is so hard to shed in your teens, in your 20s with my MBA students, in your, 30s with my executive students, in your 40s with my leaders. So how can we even start to invite our kids at an early age when they come to us, this or this, and just invite them to think, well, what would the other perspective think? What's the other side of this? Help me understand what a possibility is. I found that to be actually quite powerful. And there's increased research that's looking at that.
That actually gets me into one of my questions later on, is that should we be teaching our kids this approach? And you basically answered that. It's not like PG-13 where you got to wait till you're 13 or, wait till they're in college. So you're saying even at a toddler, 5, 6, 7-year old later on, push your kids to do more paradoxical thinking and not necessarily keep them so constrained and simplified.
And I think that what that looks like, yes, yes, absolutely. And what that, and it's sort of like growth mindset that has now taken hold of, like, Carol Dweck's ideas and Angela Duckworth's idea, that's taken hold of K through 12 thinking broadly. How do you move your kids from either I'm good at this or I'm not good at this to I can learn, I can grow, I can develop? How can you move your kids from either you get your way or your sibling gets their way, to how can we think about the different needs you both have and figure out a way you can both get your needs met, or whatever it might be? And I think that the way into that is to start with two things, even with our young kids. The first is to say, hey, help me understand what you're thinking about this. What do you think the other person might be thinking about this? Plant for them the perspective taking question. And I think the other is plant for them the both and question. Oh, how could we accommodate this need and that need at the same time?
What would you say is the number one way that that type of thinking could help this country? Obviously, this country is at a very critical part in its existence, in so many different facets. But if you could pick one area where that both type thinking would benefit this country the most.
So many. I mean, we are recording this before the US election. And we are in a heated moment right now where people are feeling deeply existential about politics. And that experience is, I think, having two really detrimental impacts. The first is that it's tearing up families. And the second is that it is limiting the possibility of what our politics can actually get done. And and it's reinforced and mediated by both social media and increasingly regular media. Like, if you listen to the news these days, there is no pathos or conversation that invites in or disagreement, civil discourse across opposing ideas. It's commentators trying to make a very strong, aggressive statement about something on both sides. And um, I think that what we need right now is to go back to the founding of democracy, which was indeed, how do we think about competing perspectives and be in civil discourse about that? And, one of my favorite books on this topic is Parker Palmer's Healing the Heart of Democracy, where he makes an argument for the importance of the town halls in small communities where you can build trust with people who have a different point of view and work through and honor some of your differences and agree to disagree, but at least start by listening and building trust and respect, knowing that it's imperfect. There's an imperfect solution that we're all going to get to, but we're going to be in that messy experience process of learning from and working with each other. We don't do that anymore. We shout to each other on social media, mediated by or protected by the fact that we're not in person and we can just shout whatever we want from our gut because we're feeling uncomfortable and we just want to shout it out.
So let's say our listeners are intrigued by this, which I'm sure they are, and they want to adopt this way of thinking. How do our listeners cultivate this mindset, and give us some examples of a daily routine where our listeners could benefit from the power of paradox?
Yeah, so I mean, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier. Our thought on the entry level on this is is to change the question. So let me take a step back. One of the things that we do in this book that you had mentioned was that we've been studying this for about 25 years in academia, and there's an increased amount of knowledge about how do we do this, that question you're asking. And so in the book, we do two things. We say, look, first of all, we want to make the case to demonstrate why we either or so much, why it's problematic, and how both and is a possible and important alternative. If you're on board with us with that, then how do we get to that next question that you're asking, which is, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we get to that approach? And we pull together, we curate the research of our colleagues, and there's great colleagues around the world doing this scholarship to say what do we do, and we put it together in four buckets, four sets of tools about what has to happen. And then we very conveniently, and it took quite some time to get there, labeled it with labels that are A, B, C, D, so that it would be easy to remember: assumptions, boundaries, comfort, and dynamics. But what we mean by that is assumptions are, how do we change our mindsets around these things in order to engage the both and. Comfort is then, skipping over to comfort, is then how do we think about the emotions that surface when we're trying to accommodate competing demands, our defensiveness, our anxiety, our uncertainty. And we are really clear that when it comes to the emotions, how do we name them, realize they're uncomfortable, not try and sweep them away, but find comfort in the discomfort, figure out how to live with those uncomfortable emotions and move forward and not let them stop you. And then B and D is, how do we create the structures around us to make this work, the context. So the B is, how do we create the scaffolding of structures and systems that support both and thinking. In organizations, it's about having a bigger, broader agenda that your competing demands come into, like Paul Pullman's higher purpose. How do you create guardrails so you don't fall too far to either side? Like making sure you're surrounded by people that don't let you extend or fall off or take a position that's so extreme. And then D is dynamics. How do you make sure that you're allowing yourself to constantly change, shift, enable serendipitous moments where these two things can come together, be open to processual changes and not so stuck.
Last question, because I know you're very busy. You've accomplished so much in your career. Again, for this podcast, doing my research, your background is so impressive. What's your next challenge?
Oh, thanks. Um, I mean, I am thinking in two directions. Mostly, I'm thinking about the question of how do we do a step back, look underneath, and say, why do we get stuck? So why do we get sort of stuck and narrow our point of view and narrow our positions and narrow our thinking? And what would it take for us to be more expansive? What do we have to do in our personal lives, and what do we have to surround ourselves to have a more expansive outlook? And I'm also doing a lot of thinking about how do we train people to help us live into this both and more profoundly, both to help our organizations and our leaders, and but also to help our systems and society more broadly, because this either or is really diminishing our society.
What a terrific interview. Wendy, thank you for the time. It's such a fascinating concept because we all kind of view ourselves as hopefully leaders in our own right. And I think the way that you propose thinking is so different than what we normally do. And yet, when you really think about it, it's so much more creative and it really breaks down all the barriers. And so I really urge our listeners to read your book and understand the power of paradox and why it's not either or. And I think that the sooner we do that, the better we're going to be, not only as a country, but as a civilization.
Yeah, and if your leaders want, I welcome people engaging. We now have a newsletter on Substack called "It's Not an Either Or," and we're constantly exploring these issues in really specific spaces. And happy to think about what it would look like in the medical space specifically, but just also broadly. So we welcome people to join us there.
Absolutely, Wendy. Thank you so much for your time. Talk soon. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.